Hello and welcome to the first part of the metallics, oils, chipping and oil weathering. I didn't have a very catchy name for this. It's kind of like a big conglomeration of a lot of different things in this video, but I'll try and be as brief and as concise as I possibly can. Okay, to begin with, I did leave off the green of the Death Guard. That should have been covered in the last video. I'll cover it here. The green I'm using is slightly unusual in that it's not the drab khaki affair that you normally get with this Legion. So we begin with a base of deep green by Vallejo, and this is applied across the entirety of the green portions. It's a 2-to-1 mix, so 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. And once a solid base has been applied, I then add some Nacre, which is a scale 75 paint, and that's a 1-to-1 paint to thinner ratio. It's a slightly thinner ratio. Now it's important, as with the last stage, that we do not include any water, and we do not include any heat. Very, very important. If you included any heat or water, we run the risk of destroying the effect, which I'm about to do. It went on slightly too thick in that portion. I thought I could dab it off. Big mistake. What was my original point? Yeah, if you use heat, it cracks the paint. If you use water, you run the risk of destroying the underlying pattern. We want absolute control, so when we do apply the water, we can chip it up as we need to. The final stage is a very thin down glaze of Rhinox hide. This is roughly, I don't know, 1 to 2 paint to thinner. So 1 part paint, 2 parts thinner. Apply very, very lightly across. If I could use a footballing analogy, you're taught to play the game with soft feet. So you kind of caress the ball, you have more control over its soft feet. That's what we need to apply here. We need soft feet to airbrush the Rhinox hide into the shadows. Of the white. Okay, I made a mistake earlier in the video by trying to remove or trying to dab off excess moisture. I've frequently said on this channel that there are no accidents, just happy coincidences, and this is very much the case here. I noticed a really nice fragmentation pattern I was getting from the chipping effect over such a large area. So I decided, okay, let's try and push this a little further. Let's try and exploit this. I apply warm water through the airbrush across the green, and this towelette, or this towel, is I bought it from an automotive store, Halfords in this country. It's designed for oil changes, so it's slightly thicker, slightly denser, slightly tougher than your usual kitchen towel. And I lightly dab that across the surface of the miniature, and I noticed I was actually bringing off a really nice textured pattern. Yeah, it turned out to be an absolute blessing in disguise. So that's how the chipping effect was done on the green portions, and that is how I would have done those large areas of the white if I had known this trick beforehand. And now you do, so you can learn from my mistakes. Or happy accidents. There's no accidents, only happy coincidences. Okay, on to the metallic. So it's a very quick way of painting the miniature without masking anything. Just take a piece of paper and place it against the surface where you don't want it to roll. I'm using magnesium. This is from the Vallejo Air Metal range. Really gorgeous set of colours, and this is undiluted. This is straight through the airbrush. We only need 1 base layer. It's not a very complex stage whatsoever. It's quite a boring stage to go through, but it does mean we can do all the modulation, all the nice chipping effects later on, all the nice chipping effects we could do here with our oils. Okay, if you're unsure about using oils for the first time, there is a separate video tutorial on an introduction into oils. It's very important that you thin it with the appropriate oil thinner. In this case, I'm using Winsor & Newton Sansador. Sanzo oil thinner. And we'll be doing 2 processes with the oil paint. First off, we'll be using a pin wash. This is a very heavily diluted version of using oil paint, where we put roughly 1 part paint, so 1 part oil, to 3 parts thinner. I'm using lamp black and burnt sienna. As you can see from my palette, it's a little bit of a mix, a little bit of a mess. So giving an exact colour quantity would be misleading. I mix very freely in between the two. When it comes to panel shading for the pin wash, I tend to put more black to show off the lines of the miniature. When it comes to oil weathering, or when it comes to doing slight modulation with the oils, I will include more brown in the mixture. But be aware that the black does really overwhelm the burnt sienna. The great thing with using oil paints, if you're watching this video for the first time, if this is the very first video that you're watching in the series, well, welcome on board. But again, this can be very, very intimidating. Have a look throughout the... have a look at the bottom of this post, and you should see tabs, one of which will be hashtag weathering or weathering tab. Click on that and it takes you to every single weathering tutorial done on this channel. Have a look through it, have a look through the PDF guides, gain familiarity with it, and then try on the miniature. One thing you'll notice, one stage that you'll notice on this piece, is that this has not been given a gloss varnish coat. I repeat, this has not been given a gloss varnish. When you read other weathering guides, it is recommended that you apply a gloss varnish for this stage. I've chosen not to do so here because when you add a gloss varnish to a surface, it does make the surface much more coherent in terms of applying colour to it, so it makes the paint more predictable in where it flows. However, you do lose a little contrast. In this case, I've decided not to use a gloss varnish. I want to keep the matte appearance as much as I possibly can. Even if you apply a matte varnish over a gloss varnish surface, you do still lose contrast. I wanted to preserve this look as much as I possibly can. And the beautiful thing about using oil paints in this way, well, you thin them with oil thinner. It will not reactivate the hairspray underneath the paint job, or it won't activate the chipping medium that you have, because it's a completely different medium. Oil and water, never shall they mix. Unless you use an emulsifier, but that's beside the point. Okay, that blows my metaphor. The next thing we'll be using is a stain. This is a much thicker solution of paint. We are using roughly, I don't know, about 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner at this point. It does go on quite thick. And the idea of this is to stain the underlying layer. So when we do remove it with a swab, when we do remove it with a brush, it won't remove the oil paint entirely. Instead, it will give a really nice, realistic, mottled effect to the metallics. Now, staining effects I only use on metallics because you kill a lot of color interest, you kill the sheen, you kill contrast. However, we can do it at this stage. We can do it on the metallics. Why? Because it has no depth. It has no contrast. It's set up for us to build on top of it. And that's what the stain allows us. That's what the stain gives us. That artificial depth that we could build up very, very quickly. Now, I have been asked whether you can use a stain on faces, on more organic surfaces. I personally wouldn't use them because I like building up those volumes and depth myself with brush control, with colour choice. However, if you feel inspired to try this technique on a miniature, go ahead, do it. I want to see the results. These videos, as ever, are only jumping off points. They are not definitive guides on how to paint with oil paints. These are processes that I use to get these effects, and it is a constant work in progress. I never feel like I've mastered a technique. It would be boring if you master a technique, because there's nothing else to learn, there's nothing else to explore. So with oil paints, I feel very much like I'm on a journey alongside you guys. Maybe a little bit farther ahead because I have experience using them. But never feel like you master a technique. It's like completing the game. You never go back to that game once it's done. Well, maybe do for replay value. I don't know. I don't know your gaming habits. But for me, once I've done a book, I may come back to it every now and again. This analogy's fallen flat. I'm just going to end it here. Oil paints, they are fantastic and they are forgiving. They are very, very they are an incredibly forgiving medium. With acrylic paints, we have a working life of around 2 to 3 seconds, if we're lucky, before it dries up, and that's it. The brush stroke is indelible, that's the mark made forever. With oil paints, they have a drying time of around a week. If you make a mistake, you have around a week to correct it. In fact, perfect example up on screen, I've made a mistake with the oil wash, with the pin wash rather. I have overlapped on a piece of the armor. I didn't mean to, I didn't want it to be added to. I'm not going to correct that mistake straight away. Anything but. Instead, I will wait. I'll wait for at least 2 to 3 hours. I'll come back to it and then wipe it off. It's much easier to correct any mistakes a few hours afterward than it is straight away. The paint is still too malleable, it's still very easy to manipulate, it's still very easy to lift off the surface. When correcting these mistakes with a pin wash, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't want to remove everything I've done so far. I just want to remove those bits of oil paint that have overlapped the surface of the miniature. And we can very easily do that using the thinning agent, whichever you choose to use. In this case, I've used the Winsor & Newton oil thinner. You can buy different mediums, linseed oil. You can buy, so there's a stuff called Zest It. It's made from lemons. Smells divine. It smells like a lemon liqueur, almost like you can drink it. But do not drink oil thinning agents. That way leads to a bad path. Okay, I've zipped it on a little bit. Cover all the metallics with a stain, and then any mistakes that you make you can remove with a clean brush, some thinner. You can see how it just disappears. You can even get your finger in there as well. Roll it down, rub it down to give it the impression of an oil streak. With the oil streaks, I have waited for around 40 minutes for the paint to cure. Now, when using oil paints, I tend to make this the last thing I do in the evening before I stop hobbying. And then the next day when I come to it, this stage is ready and raring to go. You reactivate the oil paints with a very small amount of thinner. And then you can take a brush and roll it down the side, roll it down the surface of the miniature. It gives those really nice oil streaks, rain streaks, any streaks that you can imagine. In this case I've used, I think I stole this brush from my son. And my son is 18 months old, so he was very easy to overpower. But he had a set of paints. Paintbrushes given to him, and of course I stole all the cheap brushes because I love them for weathering, cut into them, made them completely unusable for him, and now I have a new weathering brush. Cheers, Dylan. Thank you. Okay, you can also use makeup applicators or makeup removers. So these are sponge applicators that you could buy from Boots. So Boots is a pharmacist in this country, does a lot of cosmetic things. If you have a wife or partner who has these, I highly advise that you steal them to save yourself the embarrassment of going into a pharmacist and buying these for yourself. But hell, what do we have to be embarrassed for anymore? It's 2020. We can do whatever the hell we like. Or you can order them online. Amazon, there you go. Anonymity via the net. Okay, I'm gently dabbing this across the surface of the miniature and removing the most prominent portions of the oil. And I'm also dabbing the surface to give it that really nice mottled modulation look to it. For the tracks, for all the metallic areas, I'm doing exactly the same thing. Now, these applicators have an advantage over Q-tips, over earbuds, in that they don't break up and fragment like earbuds do. You don't get those strings of fibre left on your miniature afterward. And when working with larger miniatures like this, it is nicer to use a larger surface area to manipulate and move them. Okay, you can see I'm reactivating the oil paint along the side of the front carapace. And it takes a couple of seconds to reactivate the oil, and once that's done, you can begin cleanup procedure. So you can remove any excess, any mistakes, or you could take advantage of your mistakes and roll them down in context with... so if you can imagine a raindrop, you are a little raindrop. You are hitting the carapace of the vehicle and you're rolling down it. Where would you roll? And that's where you need to make the sweeps of your brush. It gives the impression of oil and dirt and soot that have been thrown up against the side of the vehicle when it rains it pours, and it creates these streaks down the side of the vehicles. If it picks up any oil paint as you do this, cool, because it creates an oil stain right off the bat. Try and take advantage of the things that you see on your miniature, those mistakes that you've made, those happy accidents that occur during the painting process. Oil weathering, the way I use it in this video, it's very, dare I say, haphazard. It relies on the chaos of the moment. It's not something that I can really pre-plan each and every oil stain, because it will end up with a very artificial looking end product. The way rust forms on a vehicle, it's almost haphazard. It's a very chaotic pattern it creates itself, and as human beings, we do have a horrible habit of falling into creating patterns in our work. In order to avoid this, the chipping effects do help, and the mistakes that you make along the way, those unintentional oil slips that you make with your brush, you can then correct them later on. You can brush them down the side of the vehicle. You can make them look, you can just make the vehicle look authentic doing that. Okay, next step. We are adding some dark grey and Rhinox hide. So dark greys from the Vallejo range. Please don't feel like you have to use these exact colours. A dark grey, you can make a dark grey by mixing black and white together. Maybe add a touch of turquoise in there if you're feeling fancy, but black and white will do, and then Rhinox hide. The actual mixture itself, it changes, so in some instances I'm using a 50-50 blend, in other instances I'm using closer to like 60-70% in favour of one of those colours. Again, chaos. Chaos is the key. I'm using a sponge, the kind of sponge I find in the foam you get to protect your miniatures. And I'm applying this across the surface of the miniature. I'm concentrating the chips on any hard edge surfaces where chips would naturally occur. And the paint is taken from the palette onto a piece of paper, and I remove about 90% of the paint. It's a struggle to impart any paint from the sponge onto the miniature itself. It's a real hard slog to get it off. So you can think of this as a dry brush consistency, where there's very, very little paint on the applicator. And any that rolls off, it will create those incidental chips. Again, I'm aiming for any hard edges on the surface of the sculpt, wherever you'd think to add an edge highlight if you're using a traditional Games Workshop methodology for painting the miniature. That's where I'm adding these chips. For the silver, I'm using Silver by Vallejo Air. Again, same paint consistency. So very thin. Well, the paint itself is undiluted. Completely and utterly undiluted. I like using the air paints because they have that perfect consistency to use just straight off the bat, even with a normal brush or a sponge. I remove 90% of the paint from the applicator and I lightly dab it across the surface. You'll notice the technique, it's not a sweeping motion, it's a stabbing motion up and down off the vehicle. I don't want any smudges, I don't want to roll it over the surface. It's a very much a stabbing motion again and again and again. Okay, let's up the difficulty factor. We will be adding Deathless Metal from Formula P3, beautiful colour. And before that dries, we are taking silver, again with a sponge. And we are wet blending this onto the top of the barrel. Yep, we are wet blending. How do I phrase this? Wet smudging, maybe? Yeah, let's go with that. We are wet smudging. God. Okay, you can see how simple was it to create that really nice mottled metallic. It's a single layer of a metallic paint, which we've given a stain with black and brown oil paint, allowed it to cure, and now we're chipping the edges of it. And look at the depth that's produced. It's crazy, right? How quick and simple this technique is to give you phenomenal results. I think the key to getting a really good result on that kind of large metallic is when you're removing the paint. You don't want to remove every single centimeter, every single little bit of moisture. You want to dab, you want to finesse it, you want to smudge it, maybe the oil paint I'm talking about. Smudge the oil paint to create these oily effects on the surface. Okay, again, any very, very hard edge surfaces, I'm adding some silver chipping to. So we have the rust showing through the vehicle, and then we have incidental chips and dirt and marks, and then we have the metallic showing from underneath the vehicle. So we have those three stages to build up the depth of the weathering. So from very simple beginnings, where the paint recipe isn't that complex, it's shades of khaki and then shades of green. Nothing overly complicated about that. Very broad application. We aren't doing anything fancy. You can use any kind of airbrush in order to achieve that effect. But it's through the oil paint and the chipping and the weathering that we create the depth, that we create the feeling, that we create the story. And weathering, you have to remember, tells the story of the miniature, where it's been, what is the context you are viewing this piece in. Okay, next up, one of my favorite things to do on these kind of weapons, blue-green filter by Wilder. It's quite generous application to represent the build-up of dirt and detritus, and maybe some of the oxidization that can affect las cannon coils. I don't like using glow effects that much on Heresy Marines or Heresy armies, but this oxidization is a very quick, easy, simple way to give a freaking phenomenal result. I would caution you against really lathering it on. A generous amount isn't overdoing it. A generous amount will give the really nice blue-green patina effect. And that's it for part 1 of this. I don't know what to call this tutorial, so part 1 of this portion of the tutorial. Part 2 coming up soon. Thank you.